today. And so what we have in store in the next hour and a half or so today is a showcase. And the genre of a showcase is an interesting one insofar as it is meant to feature for us in some ways and to put on display and to learn from the diversity of work and approaches and genres that folks who are associated with and a part of the work of the Social Justice Institute are engaged in. And so we will have a little bit of a taste, if you will, of the diversity of work that happens with and alongside and through the Social Justice Institute. And so we have 4 folks who will be engaging us today, presenting some of their work. We have from the farthest left, my left, is Kim Snowden, who is teaching faculty here in the Social Justice Institute. Our resident media darling on folk and fairy tales, among other things, teaches across the curriculum here in the Social Justice Institute. We have Becky Ross, who is a professor with cross appointments in the Social Justice Institute and in sociology, and is the author of the book Burlesque West, which is a book that highlights some of her historical work on the politics of sex work here in Vancouver. We have Manuel Antwi from the Department of English, an assistant professor, who is also a dear friend, and who, not that the other folks but his book tells me is very recently also the co-editor of a special issue on Black, writing Black Canada's out of the journal Transitions. And then finally we have Geraldine Pratt from the Department of Geography, who is a Canada Research Chair in I Forget. A long title that includes generally work on feminist geographies, performance, migration, and Filipino diaspora studies, among other things. And on a personal note, Jerry was also my postdoctoral research supervisor, one of them. And so you can blame her for part of why I am here. So I don't know in what order we want to go, but if Kim is open to it, maybe we will go from the from that way.
Okay. I told you everything you need to know about my pedagogy right there. There's cats on the screen. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Okay. So thank you for being here today. The title of my talk here, Social Justice Storytelling, relates to a course that I taught earlier this year, and that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Also, with the help of the Lego academics on Twitter, we're going to talk a little bit about academic overwork in relation to social justice work that we do here at the Institute. Around the time I started planning this talk, I read an essay by Melissa Dalgleish on the wonderful blog called Hook and I, called Why Can't We Be Our Whole Selves as Academics? In the essay, Dalgleish talks about the formal rules that govern things like hiring practices, postdocs, funding, and so on, but also the informal rules that can determine our ability to be successful in our academic pursuits. Dalgleish suggests that these informal rules determine how much of ourselves, our personal lives, our stories, we are expected to edit out of our academic profiles, and how we are viewed or judged if we don't. She asks, what does an academic culture that requires us to elide our personal lives, to treat our bodies as containers for our brains, to elevate intellect over affect, do that's useful to the academy? Does it make academic work appear more legitimate, and if so, to whom? I've been thinking about this a lot lately, how this relates to my pedagogy and research, and what counts as legitimate in academia. I've noticed that there is a difference in how and where I talk about certain things, what I talk about publicly on social media and other places, and what I leave out in teaching and in everyday engagements in my academic life. In my teaching, I've been focused a lot on the emotional labor of teaching and learning and on wellness and empathy both in and outside of the classroom. Often this means shifting traditional forms of assessment and pedagogy, and I encourage my students to use their own stories as ways to make sense of complex issues and readings. But often they struggle with this same question of legitimacy and value. Should they tell their own stories or should they write an academic essay? And this distinction has been troubling me a lot recently, especially when we're teaching about social justice. This isn't to say that we should discard all formal pedagogical practices and simply talk about feelings. It's a bit more complicated than that, and it's about really finding a balance. In the classroom, I often turn to the work of Jessica Yee, whose edited collection called Feminism for Real, Deconstructing the Academic Industrial Complex of Feminism, brings together artists, activists, writers, and scholars to discuss what Yee calls gatekeeping in academia, that often reproduces colonial, ableist, and classist discourses and limits what kind of work is considered valuable and legitimate, particularly in academic feminism. So I want to talk a little bit more about this today, what counts as legitimate academic work, and to tell you the story of some of the ways that this comes into play in my own teaching and research and the intersections between the two. I've been engaging a lot in social media conversations about academia, but also thinking about the ways that scholars, writers, activists, those whose work I use myself in teaching and research, engage in public pedagogy, do things like blogs, social media, podcasting, and so on. So to begin, I want to talk about one of the people, someone whose work I use in class. And I start with Teju Cole. Cole's work has been foundational for me in thinking about how I teach and also how I view myself in relation to academia. I want to focus specifically on Cole's collection of essays released in 2016 called Known and Strange Things. When I first read this collection, it instantly became one of those books that I needed to have with me at all times. I like to carry my books around when I talk about them to show them as well, just to have it. At the time, I was in the process of planning a course called Social Justice Storytelling, and this collection became a central piece of the curriculum. In fact, I threw out the entire curriculum and rebuilt it when I read this collection. I was drawn to Cole's work in part because in many ways the essays are an elaborate mapping of people, books, ideas, art, events, etc. that have affected him in some way and have become part of his story, what he calls some of my most vital enthusiasms. Of his collection, he says, the area I returned to most was photography, but literature, music, travel, and politics were also subjects in which I was deeply absorbed. Through the act of writing, I was able to find out what I knew about these things, what I was able to know, and where the limits of knowing lay. Elsewhere, he calls this also a kind of productive estrangement from home, from the familiar, from the things we think we know. But I'm also drawn to his work because of the ways in which his writing maps onto his other forms of storytelling, especially those that are public. For example, he builds playlists of music, which he publishes on Spotify and links them through all of his social media platforms. Often these are just something he loves, meant to create a mood, but they also function as a way to connect the work he is doing or the process of creating that work to a larger audience. So I'm particularly fond of his History of Jet Lag series, which corresponds to his public engagements for his work, readings, exhibitions, interviews, but connects his audience to his work in a different way. Cole's use of social media sites like Instagram also take up this idea. It's also a kind of productive estrangement that he produces here that challenges the viewer to question, as Cole says, where the limits of knowing lie. His images are often just fragments or the suggestion of a person or place, sometimes captioned, sometimes not. Sometimes the same image is repeated multiple times but captioned differently. This can be disconcerting for a site like Instagram, which relies on a kind of curatorial language for its users. Captions, hashtags, filters, all things that are expected on a social media site, but that Cole disrupts most of the time. In the social justice storytelling class, we use Cole's work, including his Instagram images and Spotify playlist, alongside the writing of Rustai, Dion Brand, the scholarship of Shireen Razak, Sarah Ahmed, among others, as a framework for anti-colonial intersectional practices, but also in terms of centering stories in the classroom and rethinking traditional forms of knowledge production, what counts as legitimate academic scholarship. In particular, Cole became the inspiration for an assignment called Social Media Story Mapping, where students map the social media profile of an artist, writer, or activist. So I have an example here, used with permission from the student who made it, of the mapping of a Nigerian poet, where the student has collected various social media moments as a way to tell a larger story about her work. Just show you this. So categorizing according to the themes of the class, but also then, capturing moments from various public platforms and social media profiles to talk about poetry. But in many ways, she has sort of put it together almost like a piece of poetry itself. You don't need to know the larger body of work in order to see and hear the poetry on the site in the way that it has been produced. Cole's work has also been really influential in my own thinking about social media and research. Like most people, I perform on social media in specific ways. After the social media story mapping project, I started thinking more about how these versions of myself across these platforms and the communities that I've built there in these platforms tell a story about my whole self in academia, or perhaps more accurately, the kind of academic and writer that I want to be. My Instagram will tell you that I have cats, that I drink wine, that I love books. But if you look closer and you read sort of between the lines or read some of the captions and hashtags, it also tells you that I actually once upon a time wanted to be a writer and take creative writing. I was discouraged from that path by my parents, and that the writer in me is quietly whispering to me every day, more and more. On my Twitter feed, it might just appear that I like to watch a lot of television and live tweet TV shows alongside thousands of teens, but it also tells you that this is actually part of a larger research project where I'm looking at fandoms in popular culture and the ways in which gender and sexuality are represented through fan engagement in public forums, connecting to the writers and creators who are making their creative process accessible to the public by joining in these conversations, a sort of public performance of their work. Social media is also a map of academic labor, and I use it as an archive to think about things that work or don't in teaching, but also about how I perform scholarship on different platforms. And a lot of my social media might suggest to some that I am unhappy with this work. When I look through my social media, there's a lot of complaining, and also that I am very tired. But I think it more accurately speaks to the culture of overwork that is pervasive in academia. And this is especially true for those of us who are precariously employed, sessionals and non-tenure stream lecturers, where overwork is also a necessity for financial survival. And more I find that it's public pedagogy where these issues are being most effectively discussed, whether this is through threads on Twitter or through other things like podcasting. For example, Dr. Hannah Mcgregor, who teaches in the SFU publishing program, creates a brilliant podcast called Secret Feminist Agenda. She also has an excellent podcast on Harry Potter as well, which brings together writers, scholars, activists, and often turns to discussions of academia. In a recent episode, McGregor refers to the same piece by Dalgleish in relation to the stigma of talking about mental health in academia for both students and faculty. She critiques the academic culture of overwork and that we are often praised for how hard we work, even if that work is making us sick. This model of success is expected in academia, and overextending ourselves has become the norm. Listening to Secret Feminist Agenda this week got me thinking about where happiness falls in all of this, and finding the joy not just in teaching, but in doing social justice. When so much of what we teach is about how terrible the world is it possible to find joy in the work that we do and to encourage our students to find joy in talking and thinking and writing about this stuff? I'm currently reading Adrienne Marie Brown's wonderful book, Emergent Strategy. Also have my file here. Shaping Change, Changing Worlds. I discovered Brown through the collection that she co-edits with Walida Imarisha called Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories for Social Justice Movements. I teach this book in my sci-fi and fantasy class because Brown and Imarisha talk about how we can move beyond teaching literature that focuses on social justice to using stories themselves as a way to practice social justice, particularly science fiction, which they suggest can be a model for imagining a better world and a future free of oppression. Brown takes up similar ideas in Emergent Strategy, which she defines as a method for practicing complexity through simple interactions. Brown's book is meant to make us feel joy in the connections we make and therefore in the work that we do. Brown takes her inspiration from the work of Octavia Butler and other writers and merges it with her work in social justice organizing. Emergent strategy, initially a way to describe what she calls the adaptive and relational leadership models for found in the work of Octavia Butler and other writers, and then growing into action, plans of action, tools for collective organizing, personal practices that account for the kind of constant changes that happen in our lives and the relationships that we rely on for these adaptations. She says, many of us have been socialized to understand that constant growth, violent competition, and critical mass are the ways to create change. But emergence shows us that adaptation and evolution depend more upon critical, deep, and authentic connections. A thread that can be tugged for support and resilience, the quality of connection in the nodes between the patterns, dare I say, love. And we know how to connect. We long for it. I'm using Brown's work as a model for leading the GRSJ practicum next term, but also in how I'm starting to think more broadly about teaching, how I want to engage with academia in general. Recently, I tweeted a thread about academic precarity and being a good enough scholar, what constitutes good enough and who decides. In the framework laid out by Dalgleish at the start of my talk on gatekeeping and legitimacy in academia, my trajectory would be considered a failure. I've never wanted a research job. I've only ever wanted to teach and sometimes write and have some semblance of financial stability to do the thing that I love. But academic culture requires that you are always striving for more, competing for more, doing more work to prove that you are worthy of the thing that already takes up every single minute of the day. One of the things that Brown emphasizes in her model for emergent strategy is resilience, but that to be strong, to be resilient, self-care is vital. We can't take care of others and change the world if we don't care for ourselves. And what if this is central to the way we teach and practice social justice? To tug on those threads that Brown talks about for support and resilience, and as Cole says, bring our most vital enthusiasms to the classroom to tell our stories and bring our whole selves. When we give talks like these, or when we present at conferences, we are asked to provide a short biography. This is supposed to tell you what we do, but it also assumes that this is who we are. And it is something I've always found hard to write, because it makes me feel like I'm doing academia wrong, or a list of all the things that I'm not. And so to end today, I want to go back to the beginning, and I would like to reintroduce myself. But this time, using my social media profile, which tells you about me in ways that make sense. Feminist, storyteller, academic, teacher of fairy tales, sci-fi, fantasy, and YA, lover of monsters, cat lady, wine drinker, book nerd, vampire slayer.
We will reserve questions for the end, so I'll ask you folks to hold on to your questions, and we'll get Becky to present next.
Do I just press return to advance? Yes. You press to move forward, you press this. This is not return. I think those may work.
Oh, why is it showing that way?
I don't know. Do you have any idea?
Maybe just switch the walk this way. Yeah, they are. I don't think they were weird.
Oh, I see. Sorry. I'm a little stuck. Can you do that switch that swap display to check it? There you go. There we go. Okay.
Fabulous. Thank you, Chair. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, just to echo JP, I want to acknowledge my place today on the unstolen lands of the Musqueam people. I want to thank everyone for coming today, to thank Denise and Jen for the invitation and promotion, to Emmanuel for helping us out today as well. It's my sincere honor to share this cabaret bill with my esteemed co-presenters. I regret that Jamie Lee is not with me today. Our talk is part of a piece that we co-wrote for the BC Studies Journal that will be published in the spring as the first in a new section of the journal devoted to community academic collaborations. So just so you have a sense of who we are here, my friend and collaborator for the past 21 years, Jamie Lee Hamilton, is Métis Cree, Two-Spirit, community leader, entrepreneur, researcher, and sex worker. I am a white, cis-femme, settler of Scottish and Dutch heritage, an academic activist and sex educator. In 2007, after 10 years of loving friendship and various shared initiatives, including my work with Jamie Lee at Grandma's House, which was a safe house for sex workers in the East End, and my participation in 4 of Jamie Lee's political campaigns for City Council and Park Board, I secured a SSHRC grant to investigate the expulsion of sex workers from Vancouver's West End in 1984. Jamie Lee is a survivor of this expulsion, and for years we used SSHRC funds to chronicle the maturation of a pimp-free outdoor brothel culture of approximately 200 diversely gendered and racialized sex workers who made the West End their home and workplace, beginning in the mid-1960s. Guided by Indigenous researchers' insistence on the ethical enactment of the 4 Rs, respect, responsibility, relevance, and reciprocity, and principles of participatory action research, Jamie Lee and I conducted interviews with the few remaining hookers on Davie, and we did extensive and emotionally draining work in colonial archives, building on the scrupulous research of criminologist John Lohman. We found, among many things, that sex workers' earnings in the West End fueled the city's economic growth. Cis women, trans women, and cis male hustlers consumed goods and services, fundraised for community organizations such as the Dogwood Monarchist Society, and performed in gay venues such as BJ's Lounge. As Jamie Lee has written, anti-sex work groups were quick to portray our section of the West End as residential. However, sex workers plied our trade in the commercial part that had many 24-hour businesses operating 7 days a week along Davie. Street-based sex workers developed efficacious strategies for risk assessment, harm reduction, economic capacity building, kinship bonding, commitment to beauty, style, and fashion, cohabitation, and grassroots organizing through the city's first sex worker rights organization, the Alliance for the Safety of Prostitutes. Their organizer newsletter, and including bad date sheets, and also organizational efforts such as this demonstration on Broadway in April of 1983. Trans sex workers shared a vision and passion for justice with the African American and Latinx hookers and trannies who fought against police violence at Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco in 1966, and also at the Stonewall Inn in New York in 1969. In July of 1984, Chief Justice of the BC Supreme Court, Hannah Mcgregor, leveled an injunction writing, quote, prostitutes on Davie Street were a blatant, aggressive, and disorderly public nuisance. They defiled our city by taking over the streets and sidewalks for the purpose of prostitution, end of quote. To remedy what he called an urban tragedy, Mcgregor prohibited sex workers from living and working in their West End neighborhood. Then Mayor Mike Harcourt, the Attorney General, Brian Smith, MP Pat Carney, championed Mcgregor's unprecedented ruling. Engineers of the anti-prostitution juggernaut, Crow, or concerned residents of the West End, led by white gay man Gordon Price, and the vigilante posse Shane the Johns, were ecstatic. Their multi-year crusade to purge what they termed a de facto red light district from their predominantly white seaside middle-class enclave had paid off. Keen to cleanse and whiten the West End in advance of the World's Fair Expo 1986, moral entrepreneurs of all political stripes rejoiced in their victory to save the West End from what they called plunging real estate values, a compromised tourist economy, and what they called the doom of a decaying dumping ground. Imperiled whiteness and renewed fears of declining white prestige, to cite Renisa Mawani, undergirded mobilization against racialized, cross-class, and carnal proximities. This is what Jamie has to say. We were no force against the ballooning white middle class and their friends in high places and political power. It was a social massacre. The injunction disenfranchised us and split us from one another. It was like residential schools for First Nations was a social massacre. Kill the Indian in the child. This was kill the sex worker in the West End. For Jamie Lee and others, a series of forced relocations led to what became prostitution genocide on the killing fields of the downtown East Side, where more than 65 women, disproportionately Indigenous, some trans, some queer, have gone missing and murdered. So for 10 years, determined to share our research findings with multiple publics, Jamie Lee and I maximized every opportunity promiscuously to attend conferences, give public talks, host community forums, consult at the Museum of Vancouver, facilitate workshops. We wrote co-wrote an op-ed for the Vancouver Sun. We did media interviews. We co-wrote 2 formal briefs to the Vancouver's mayor, Gregor Robertson, and city councillors. We also concretized the activist arm of our community-based research. In November 2008, we co-founded the West End Sex Workers Memorial Committee. After 10 months of regular meetings, our committee held a commemorative event in July of 2009 to mark the so-called anniversary of expulsion, a barbecue, screening of the documentary Hookers on Davie, a panel of speakers, and a walking tour, which we continue to host several times a year. We call it the Strolling the Stroll, a commemorative stroll. Sex worker members of our 15-person committee decided that rather than pursue individual claims of redress or a class action suit, they wanted some form of public commemoration with an official civic apology. They envisioned a permanent lamppost, which symbolized for them safety, security, and belonging, making the case to city staff that our memorial would be the first in Canada. We acknowledge other public efforts to honor sex workers, including 3 small plaques scattered across the state of California, as well as the Crossbones Graveyard here in South London, which honors the unnamed prostitutes, the Winchester geese, buried underground during medieval times, the plaque memorials, the outcast dead. Then we have also Joy, Louis Fraser's sculpture, now in Macquarie University's Sculpture Park in Sydney, Australia, to commemorate the century of working women in inner city Sydney. And then finally, we have Bell, honors Dutch sex workers in Amsterdam's red light district in front of Oudekerke, which is Amsterdam's oldest church. By July of 2015, then, after many months of meetings, we secured financial support to construct our memorial from Mayor Robertson and then City Manager Penny Balaam. The budget was commensurate with $28,000 in fines collected illegally from sex workers in 1982 under the then street activities bylaw mandated by Mayor Harcourt. While the figure did not reflect the interest accrued over 31 years, our settlement included thousands of additional dollars paid out in salaries to city staff in departments of social planning, engineering, cultural services, and communications. We were elated, which is an understatement. Bankrolling a sex workers monument is not like fundraising for breast cancer, childhood diabetes, or heart disease. Coincidentally, our desire for a lamppost enabled us to circumvent the city's lengthy and sticky process of arbitrating and installing public art. The city already fabricates a range of lamps for city streets, parks, and facilities, and so we work with engineering and the manufacturer Nova Poles to adapt a current design with the Victorian flair and the luminous red light. So this is it at the corner of Jervis and Pendrell. Has anyone had a chance to actually visit the memorial? In the room, just a couple of people. Thank you very much for that. Then there's the lamppost and the red light as well. We unveiled our memorial on September 16, 2016. We had Elder Stuart Gonzalez from the Squamish Nation offer a greeting and welcome. We had 25 speakers, including sex worker activists, community leaders, and politicians from across the political spectrum, including former Mayor Philip Owen. This is Jamie Lee addressing the crowd of about 200 people. Mayor Robertson declined to offer a formal apology. Fearing backlash, he hid cowardly behind his earlier concession to sex work abolitionists that, quote, all sex work equals violence against women. Unexpectedly, Superintendent from Vancouver Police Department, Michelle Davey, apologized to the crowd for years of disrespectful treatment towards sex workers by members of the VPD. Our memorial joins other monuments installed across Vancouver to honor marginalized groups. A pedagogical instrument of symbolic justice, it freights the promise of combating the scourge of forgetting. There are 4 distinct panels here dedicated to a diverse community of sex workers, people who lived and worked here from mid-1960s to 1984. Today, we commemorate and honor their lives and in memory of their ongoing struggle for equality. Though Jamie Lee and co-workers forged the foundation for what became the West End's emergent gayborhood, they have never been publicly recognized as leaders for justice, nor as founders of what was first and foremost the hookerhood. Cis and trans West End sex workers raised consciousness about working the strolls, customers, cops, lovers, co-workers, and families in the face of widespread white settler indignation, NIMBYism, and little support from logical allies, second-wave feminists, gay liberationists, or labor organizers. As the queerest of the queer rebels, trans sex workers like Jamie Lee, Stacey, and Reagan punctured the idealized norms of white, domesticized heteromonogamy, romance, marriage, and cis reproductivity. And they became unapologetically, and because they unapologetically commingled sex and economic transactions, they were routinely subjected to the moral charge of corruption and to the legal logics that still adjudicate proper and improper sexual intimacy. Notwithstanding Viviana Zelizer's claim that intrinsic to large webs of mutual obligation, money cohabits regularly with intimacy, she says, sex workers then and now have been made to pay in blood for their subaltern transgressions. This was a very heartwarming occurrence last spring as we discovered 7 bouquets left by unknown mourners at the base of the memorial. We argue that the imagined West End in the mid-1980s was contingent on the erasure of street-level prostitution and by extension, the erasure of sex worker bodies, including trans women of color, Indigenous, African-Canadian, Asian, and Filipina. Echoing Jerry Pratt's adaptation of Giorgio Agamben, the bodies of sex workers were rendered as bare life and legally abandoned, and yet they remained in relationship with sovereign power, included through exclusion. Settler state officials, led by Vancouver police, enacted what Denise Ferrer da Silva has termed a form of racialized, classed, and cisgendered border protection as biopolitical strategy, with acute physical and psychic wounds for those violated. In Vancouver's war on hookers, sex workers were cast as enemies, thus disposable to authorities, emboldened by what Akili Mbembe terms necro power, the capacity to dictate who must live and who must die. We named the West End's necro political mass eviction an act of illegal, immoral, and colonial domestic terrorism, one with lethal consequences that continue to unfold today. We are keenly cognizant that our modest lampposts will not reconcile the structural and symbolic violence that imperils sex workers, LGBTQ and two-spirit people, low-income folks, those with mental illness and or addictions, immigrants, and refugees of color. We question the power of settler state authority to resolve what Indigenous scholar Greg Coulthard terms, quote, the deleterious social impacts of interstate violence, mass atrocity, and historical injustice, through official apologies advocating forgiveness and reconciliation. The losses experienced by West End sex workers of home, workplace, livelihood, kin networks, and life itself can never be adequately apprehended nor compensated. Indeed, sex workers, especially Indigenous and trans women of color, face the daily risk of murder and dismemberment in urban and rural locales across the world. The very recent discovery of yet another physical space of extinguishment, a farm and human remains near Salmon Arm, BC, where 5 women have disappeared, is a chilling reminder of enduring trajectories of vulnerability, repudiation, and eradication. On a hopeful note, we see our memorial as marking the return of seditious outlaws, those repentant and uncontainable, who once dared ply their trade in the West End. We recognize our memorial as a testament to the resilience of what Jin Haritawarn calls trans vitalities, alongside sex work activism locally across Canada and transnationally in the US and India, Cambodia, New Zealand, Mexico, and elsewhere. To close, while we plot our way towards Jose Esteban Munoz's dream of a more inclusive future, we pose cautionary queries. 1, what are the limits of white settler state largesse packaged as reconciliation and forgiveness? 2, what might decriminalization mean as a first step towards sex workers' sovereignty? 3, how will sex workers and their intimate allyships, to borrow a term from Sarah Hunt and Cindy Holmes, continue to center claims for respect, safety, and humanity? And 4, what new coalitions must be spawned to shadow the intransigence of cis-patriarchal, neoliberal, capitalist treachery, racialized whorephobia, and white colonial rule? Thank you.
I'm going to read you a story rather than maybe do a paper today. A story that's part of a larger project that's still unfolding. I'm also going to dedicate this reading to a friend of mine who lost his father this past weekend. He's been on my mind a lot, and so I'm dedicating this reading to him. We are made a night. Once as a child, not realizing my older brother hunched by the kitchen window with his book, reciting poems to the stars, I stepped into the room, wondered out loud, what would happen if I put bread in the toaster upside down? Would the toaster blow up? He cleared his throat, searched for my eyes, then said nothing. That night, in that dark kitchen, my world turned upside down. I wondered to myself, if there are no consequences, why do I wait to exhale? Why search for certainty in things? I tend to think I'm so neurotic about everything because of my father. He made me believe I'll die if I didn't do things in specific ways. I grew up, for example, eating chicken that was twice overdone. His logic, cook meat twice as long and you won't be poisoned by the Maple Lodge Farms. My father made all 4 of his children afraid of everything, from chicken to teenage pregnancy, to monsters, to dentists, and of course, to HIV/AIDS. The disease caught me somehow on park benches back then. I was born in 1983, in the heyday of sexual panic, a panic of the night and of the queer. Yet in the midst of all this, I fed on the lyrics and rhythms of Sylvester, Marvin Gaye, Donna Summer, and Gloria Gaynor. Warnings against them trickled through every hole in my house. Turn down that hedonistic shit, my nose in book brother would scream from the kitchen. Nothing good was my father's usual contribution. His work to alienate me from my real big brothers and sisters, their voices coming through the radio. Donna, Marvin, Gloria, Sylvester. It would be these sisters who would offer me ways to language pillow talks with the night. I am part of a generation wrapped in latex that needed to be sheeted from the messiness of life, but was entangled in it all the same. My first job was a night shift carrying out emotional labor, as what they called a betweener. I was the preferred conveyor of nighttime messages between my aunts and my uncles and their respective lovers on the military base close to the park behind the river. What's behind the river is not really a park per se. What's there is a mess of unattended yard with unattended grass that makes for good seeding. There's been nights when I swear I saw a blade of grass stretch up to harvest a kiss from the moon. And the moon in turn then descends to kiss the disgrace of the backsides of lovers. Who, what there lives lives unavailable to the praying eyes of the village's lambs. I remember the muffled indignance when they finally planted a street lamp that shone into the surrounding darkness. What do park folks care for a lamp towering over their business when they can drink in the moon, a friend with energies to offer? The moon, that foolish, complicit companion who listens to runaway tongues going loose in the park. The moon that blankets folks behind the river, knowing themselves better there into silver blue mornings. In that small village, a hamlet really, if your love was against the tide of the day, if you loved deep into the night earth, you leaned on betweeners. We made our living fending off gossip. There's a stretch of time in this village when most of the villagers huddle, telling the night things. A betweener's mouth opens only in front of designated borders. it otherwise remains stitched tight in confidence. Figuring out things I don't know is what appealed to me in the job. Not saying what I knew was what made me good at the job. I'd arranged for one of my aunts to meet up with one of the captains on weeknights. And on weekends, when he leaves to visit his wife, who lives at the place they say the river ends, I arranged for the youngest, kindest sergeant at the base to meet with the same aunt at the good ceiling behind the river. I had to keep watch and not watch the sergeant's lips too much and keep the happenings to myself. Maintaining this code of watchfulness was hard but fun, confusing work for a child of 10 years old. No wonder only a handful of us grew into betweeners. There were the daytimers, afternooners, and nighttimers. I was a bump in the night child who did night work. I got good at bumping news off of antennas that other bumps bumped into the day. We, betweeners with no qualifications, call ourselves in private between energies. I remember one night, one of my uncles, who everyone dismisses because they believe him to be mad, started speaking with tongues I did not know. Everyone pretended not to listen. He'd been a betweener, and in his 50s, starts letting out all that had been stitched on his tongue. As fast as a bulb blinked, I wondered whether I would become my uncle. My life became punctuated with an overarching isolation. A lack of socialization aside from routinized existence as a conveyor of love messages at night. My desire to be part of something is only met at night, in the shadows. I am a true child of the queer night, disciplined and afraid, unaware of so many things, even while surrounded by the sounds and messages of love. Restraint, caution, private negotiations are languages of love between us know. As a child of the queer night, fluent in the experience of invisibility, of fully embracing the night to the point of training to become its operative, its conduit of love, the love I know is pure crosses, entirely and comprehensively full of trouble. Our father would tell me stories again and again, apparently to put me right. There was one about the rolling calf. It is a strange creature, almost always male, with some deformity, usually believed to host the spirits of people, butchers, they say, who spend their lifetime being unkind and dishonest. The rolling calf rolls through town on moonless nights, strolling through the streets, dragging chains. This creature, like most of the creatures in the story my father told us, was a shapeshifter, a roadside trickster who ruled the night. The version that scared me the most was the one about the hornless goat with white spots for skin and stench for breath. One of its front legs is that of a human, the other belonged to a horse. The two hind legs are those of a goat. Its eyes glow red like fire. Flames come out of its nose. On its neck is a chain, and in its hands a ball. If the creature catches you rolling about at night, it will roll its ball quickly, and no matter how fast you run, it will run past you. The ball, when it passes you, Father used to say, will transfix you into place, into the night, for the homeless creature will come for you. He would tell us this to keep us in bed at night. Funny how tales of monsters still discipline me away from nightlife. A never-ending night needs never-ending discipline. My childhood swerves into me now. That nighttime story I heard growing up becomes embedded into my perception of the night. I wonder how to navigate desires at night when I know the night is a disciplinarian, shape-shifting, the invisible danger everywhere. It will change form and might be out to get me. But what Father never told us was that the rolling calf himself is also a terrifying being. The monster is also afraid. What's their fear? Of being beaten with a tarred whip held in the left hand. Was father sanitizing the folklore by withholding such details? Or was he denying me the pleasures of the whip? Father never shared a hunter can be hunted and that a butcher can be out for flesh. I wonder, was my father's shape-shifting calf story a trick, a ploy to prepare me for working night work, to stay alert, to stay disciplined? Has the 9-to-5 shape-shifter to spend 24 hours changed form to keep me frozen at beyond the perpetual night? Being frozen by the ball hardens memories, hyper-arouses via lenses. Seated, solitary, writing, thinking of where I might but might not rather be and how little I know of it. Writing is where I'm supposed to be, or so it seems. I think of that sitting your ass down to write, the body at the scene of writing, how writing configures the body to a state of the night. Solitary, aroused, disciplined, but able to keep a secret. I bought a standing desk recently as a gesture of somatic resistance. But somehow the specter of the seated position permeates that too. Most of my writing is done seated, the position that marks the configuration of discipline. Writer in the academy or machinist in the factory assembly line, we all become instruments of the perpetual night. But then the seat also configures evasion of discipline. More masturbation is done in the seated position than any other. The seated position is a configuration of work and its avoidance, the conjuring of which just becomes another compounded form of work. I think of the fantasies that occupy one's mind, passing time during those private hours while working on assembly line. The manual manipulations, masturbation, work, writing merge into one. To what extent is the writer equivalent to the machinist or the night security guard watching CCTV, also in the seated position? His gaze on the screen, tinged with latent arousal, becomes an illicit voyeurism. Is the allure of the nocturnal calf of the quiet night arousing? An awakening is also an unveiling. Maybe the queer night is not so dissimilar to the 24/7 expanse of neoliberalism and being on the inside and outside of something. The role of discipline itself in self-preservation comes to mind. The same force at work as you sit your ass down to write is in a way fear. Fear of not getting it done, fear of the deadline, fear of failure. My childhood swerves into me now again. The rolling calf rolls within me like the seething power, the seething tower of the panopticon. Why do we scare our kids? Scare them to teach them how the world works. Follow the rules and you'll be rewarded. Deviate and you'll be punished. The fable is ideology for toddlers. A successful fable, a successful fright is one that the child believes, takes inside them, so that the compliant behavior lives much longer than the belief in the monster. I think work has a similar way of asserting itself, though the fears are different. If still Protestant, the night is idle and sinful. The more secular we are, the harder and longer we work. Like the queer night, we can never really escape the disciplinarians we have internalized. But the night offers us the possibility of keeping something secret. I know very little about queer night life. I think of when the night forced you out of fear in 1980s London to call a number to walk you home in your queerness. I think of the smartphone now, all of the microsomatic finger swipes, Grindr, Tinder, all gamified. You can progress and you can win. Love, like sex, is an achievement. Like any kind of winning in this society, you are trained to think winning or losing all comes down to you. If you are talented, if you are smart, if you put in the work, nightly. Now, writing is both my disciplined work and my queer night life. The discipline of writing queers my night, but the night makes orgasm its hostage. Seated at my desk as I write, why am I afraid? Perhaps because we are all the monsters on the street. Who are the monsters in that nightly ritual? The rolling homeless goat calf roaming in my dreams? My dad recounting the nightmare in the first place? My brother who recites poems to stars and says nothing into the dark? Or me, who at an early age became used to the idea of being frozen by the ball as fantasy to reach a state of traumatic hyperarousal, but arousal nonetheless? Who's afforded the right to avoid monsters and who's forced to be a monster? Now I know my father and the monster. I know my father is the monster. I know my father is not the monster. These are inside and outside of the dichotomy I was raised with. A life of both routinized work and queer night. I have to go through that history of my fears each time I sit my ass down. Recursively facing that history is writing. The need to face the history of myself as self each time. Each time I do it, the history of my fears come to pass, which is why it never gets easier, which is why I do it. Practice facing my fears. There is no choice but to do it, which is why we make mistakes when we do it. Big emotional mistakes. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Of course.
Yeah. Andy?
I'm kind of scared. I don't know how to articulate this question, but a theme that I've noticed, and I know, Becky Ross and I have talked about this, and so have JP and we talked about this too. But I'm curious, like in your experience, it seems like there's this common theme about academia moving more towards community-based research and stuff. I don't know how to articulate this question, but I guess my question is: are we seeing a shift, an epistemological shift, in terms of what we deem as knowledge in academia and how we gather those? Because I think, personally speaking, I'm navigating that right now. I don't know where I'm going in terms of my research, but I'm curious because it seems like you're all doing research that is a different shift from more classical canons. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, I can answer some of that at least. I think, I think, and I saw that thread in all of our work as well. I'd like to think that we're moving towards something that is more sort of challenging those traditional forms of how we think through knowledge and how we produce it, but also how we perform it, how we talk about it, how we teach it. I think that the kind of work that we're all doing is perhaps helping move the university or in that direction. I don't know whether the university itself and the sort of the ways in which everything from how funding works, how hiring works, how, whether that actually is something that can be a reality, right? I think units like GRSJ are doing that work, even in the kinds of talks that we have in the book and the way we bring together creative stuff and artists as well as academics and scholars thinking differently about what we do and how we practice it. I think that we're unique in the institution, and that's something that I think is still in process. I don't know if I have a better answer than that. Yes, I love that idea, and that's what I think we all hope for. But whether or not that's actually a reality to make those changes is a bigger question. And I think that also, it's a lot of work to have to do that stuff. And so where should that work fall, right? Where should that work? How should that work take place?
I would want that. I've been doing this work for 25 years, so I actually don't even see it as that new, the community work. It's all of the work on the LCP came out of, and why we kept doing more research together is because need to be done. So I think some of it we need to tell different narratives about the university too. Sorry, I'm just going to disagree a little bit that you know, and just kind of celebrate these long histories of doing community-based research. The stuff I do around theater, the kind of absolute confusion between social scientific research and this performance stuff, that's something a little dicier, I would say. But the community-based research just seems to be so almost like I think we need to claim it almost as a very traditional way of doing it.
Your language of epistemological shift, maybe it's not, might bring both your responses together in some sense. If maybe it's the visibility of that shift, more the legibility, maybe not visibility, and maybe the circulation of these shifts, because I think I too agree with you in terms of there's a long tradition. What the work that how I'm writing, what I'm trying to explore through this writing, has a genealogy in Black feminist writing. Like I'm not doing much different things than what Audre Lorde has done, what June Jordan, what these feminists have been doing for so long. So for me, I don't see it as a shift. It's more now, perhaps our encounters with them are much more maybe regular, and that maybe folks who are doing it are much more closer to us as opposed to reading them from a distance, perhaps. Yeah, so I think the shift might be maybe where we are and what programs we are in, than largely in that sense. But yeah, I don't think it's quite new. And I'm also kind of worried about the desire for newness, which is really quite tricky. Let's always find new ways of doing things. And so kind of situating ourselves within that tradition, for me, is quite helpful.
Thank you for those reflections. I would agree. I think that those of us who have been around for quite a while have and identify in some way as doing feminist queer and decolonial work have a kind of sort of, it's become part of us at the cellular level, this kind of politics of answerability. And I mentioned the 4 R's around reciprocity, relevance, respect, and reflexivity. So I think I can't imagine doing, unless we're writing autobiography, I think, and even then we have, there's sort of imbrications of selves in kin relations and with loved ones and so on. There is still this answerability. And I think that this is going on in other places. In GRSJ, we have the practicum, where it's not just scholars, but students who are also building up those opportunities, those inventories of a possibility of community engagement and learning on the ground what that might look like to be answerable and accountable to multiple publics. So the field school in sociology, the practicum in Indigenous and First Nation studies, so I think there are sort of spaces where that has been celebrated. I think in other spaces it's been rebuked. I know that there's a long history of repudiation of our GRSJ practicum among faculty members in psychology, for example, who felt that this was producing students who would be only engaged in advocacy research. And that means that research would be less valued, it would not be reliable, it would not be generalizable, that it would be tainted and corrupted by these kinds of convictions and passions. So I think it depends on sort of where you're at. And I'd like to think that feminist, queer, anti-colonial work and commitments to community and those dialogical relationships is all that work is expanding, but I'm not so sure.
Yeah. So I'm 2 things. So I wanted to say, first of all, what you read, it was like soul food. Like, and I haven't had good food in years. But being raised by immigrants, I've often said, like, half of the fears I have are not mine. I inherited them for my mother and my father because, you know, being Black and immigrant in the United States comes with a lot. So thank you so much for your writing. I needed it. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Snowden, in terms of what is your strategy around how do you remain accessible, radically yourself within academia? Because it seems to be not a thing.
It's in progress. And a lot of the ways that I figure out how it works is when it fails. So, for example, one of the things that started me thinking about all of this was one of my student evaluations at the end of last year, where somebody said something like, I don't feel like we got any, she didn't give us anything of herself or something. And I thought, wait, I put everything I have into this class and it didn't make any sense to me. And then I thought through a little bit more about, you know, reading some of the other evaluations, but also thought through a bit more reflecting on the class itself and wondering how, trying to think through what that meant, but also what my kind of obligation is in terms of giving myself or what that means. And, you know, I think it's difficult when we're teaching social justice work to also not, you know, I'm not going to go into class and we're not just going to, as I said before, talk about feelings and so on, but why isn't there a place for that to some degree in how we're navigating some of these topics? And so, you know, for me, it's about trying to find that spot, and in some ways, putting myself in that place first is one of the ways that I do that. But it's a constant navigation, right? And it's a constant navigation around student expectations, around, you know, particularly teaching courses that are required for GRSJ majors and minors, what the expectation is that they will come out of class learning, the things that the Faculty of Arts tells us we have to put in the course outcomes. So in one class last year, the students created the course outcomes, and then we kind of shifted them as we went, trying to figure out really what does it mean to say, here's what you'll come out of here learning, when that process changes daily, depending on how they're engaging with the work and the reading and the guest speakers and all of the things we did. So I don't know if I have an answer, except that I sort of, at the end of every semester is a kind of thinking about resetting and working with the things that went well and reflecting on the things that went badly and not being afraid to actually just, you know, screwing it up periodically and then talking about that with my students. And I think that I try to do that a fair bit, acknowledging the times when I'm not sure or I'm not, you know, really feeling like I'm fully there, and then trying to figure out how we might link that to the larger things in class. Adrienne Marie Brown helps significantly in trying to think through these processes, and I would say also a lot of the choosing texts that maybe wouldn't be on traditional curriculums and so forth as another way that I approach that. I only teach things that I really have a kind of energy for and that I really love, and that helps.
Folks want to, in the panel, want to build on or engage with that in their own practice?
It's hard. It's really, really hard. And also, I mean, the idea of failing repeatedly, and I think sometimes I struggle with how to do something otherwise that is not in the expectation of students' mode of learning. So it's a dance. Students also come in with expectations of how to learn, or we all do, wherever we go to learn. And so when something else is happening in that space, how do we also be prepared to? So I think your question also makes me think about how students are. It's not just the instructors that do that work. In many ways, it's also a lot of students do the work and oftentimes encourage us to, that we can go there or that you will go there with us. And so I think it's a collaboration in that sense. I find in the classroom anyways. And then sometimes the collaboration fails. Like, so we can come in there with all good expectation, all good intention, and we've done the work, we've thought about every way that things could work, and it will not work. And so if we begin to see the collaboration as also something that is on this part of the student, that would also challenge even rooms that are not maybe ready for that kind of radicality that you're saying are not really there. I think it can be ignited, or at least something can be planted in the room, like something else can happen. So I would like to hope that it's not only on the part of us as instructors who are possibly radicalizing the class, that in fact the students I see as having a major. In fact, most of the times it comes from that space. If I'm being honest, it comes from that space from my class. And then I have to kind of figure, okay, how do I handle this? Or how do I reject myself to deal with it? That's not how it plays out. Sometimes. Yeah.
We have a couple of minutes left. Any final thoughts? Yeah.
I think that's huge. And that's where my tendency is always to document. And I do think there's something that comes out of that document. I think that is part of our role as researchers working with theater artists to bring that kind of analysis along. So I don't think it's all negative. So I do think there's a role to play there that's an interesting one. But at the same time, with the Clinkapino Bingo, to have just left it in that room is a really interesting prospect. That it seems wasteful to an academic, which is precisely the argument that's made for the radicality of performance. It is a kind of wasteful in that way. It's, it does stay, and that's Peggy Fallon's argument around that notion that it's not so easily made. It kind of sits up. That's kind of the radicality. It sits outside of a kind of system of exchange. So, but yeah, it runs against our training, my training certainly. But I do think there's room for thinking about what the documentarian can bring to the experience and reflection and thinking about it. But it changes it. It, as you say, it becomes another piece. But and working with Indigenous artists, it became very, to work with that history of appropriation and that history was really challenging. Being an academic in that context. And working with taking the survey.
Yeah, the very big question, and I know we don't have time to get into all the particulars. What I've learned over many decades, like 4, is that sex workers, for the most part, activist sex workers, understand that the business is very complex, it's very stratified. There are
levels and densities of vulnerabilities. And just about all the sex work activists that I know, certainly in Canada, will agree that decriminalization, not legalization, is the first step. That when you have elements of the business criminalized, it puts everyone who's criminalized at risk of the cops in particular, at the risk of bad tricks, and at the risk of a kind of generalized consensus that whorephobia is common sense, is taken for granted, is hegemonic. And so when you even think about the decriminalization, for example, of homosexuality, which happened, close to 50 years ago, we see a kind of gradual sort of movement where there's sort of more embrace, collective embrace of queerness and this kind of spectrum of sexualities. And we also see a kind of crystallization of a kind of homonormativity where white, gay folks tend to want to grab up all the dividends and goodies. And certainly in the West End, we can see a lot of sort of stamping down of sex workers who were not able to lay claim to those same kinds of politics of respectability. I think legalization means that sex workers are continually interpolated by the state. And it means that the state is always in a position to decide in terms of punishments and discipline surveillances. And so sex workers are arguing that this is a job. We should instead be governed by occupational health and labor standards, safety standards, that we need to think about allegiances across different sectors of employment, hairstylists, massage therapists, service workers, food workers, and so on, and not think that somehow sex workers can be confined and contained in this very sort of discrete labor sector or non-labor sector, a kind of moral netherworld, where they continue to be so vulnerable to violences of all kinds. Sure.
All right, so we have run over time, which is not uncommon here at the Jurisdiction, because we have a very engaged audience. So I thank all of you folks for joining us today, and thank you to the panelists for showcasing for us their research.